Nuclear weapons now cast shadows over every strategic decision in this conflict, creating constraints and considerations that affect military planning, diplomatic negotiations, and international support for Ukraine. Yet these nuclear threats serve a deeper purpose than mere intimidation. They reveal how completely Putin's political survival has become dependent on achieving victory in Ukraine, regardless of the cost. Why Putin cannot afford to lose. The stakes surrounding this conflict have reached levels where retreat represents political suicide for Putin and his entire leadership structure. What began as a military operation designed to achieve limited territorial objectives has transformed into an existential struggle where backing down would likely trigger the collapse of Putin's government. The regime successfully framed this war as a defense against Western attempts to destroy Russia itself, creating conditions where any compromise appears as national betrayal rather than pragmatic diplomacy. Putin's domestic legitimacy became entirely dependent on achieving victory in Ukraine through a propaganda campaign that portrayed the conflict as Russia's most important struggle since World War II. Russian state media consistently presents the war as defending Russian civilization against Western aggression designed to fragment and weaken Russia permanently. This narrative resonates with Russian populations who experienced the chaos and humiliation of the 1990s following the Soviet collapse. The regime invested enormous political capital in convincing Russians that Ukraine represented an existential threat requiring unlimited commitment and sacrifice. Television programming regularly features experts explaining how Ukrainian victory would lead to Russian territorial losses, economic collapse, and international humiliation. Educational institutions received directives to incorporate themes about the conflict's importance into curricula across subjects, from history to literature. Religious institutions received guidance on presenting the war as a moral struggle between Russian traditional values and Western decadence. The conflict became intertwined with Russian national identity through narratives that present Ukraine as an artificial state created by Western powers to weaken Russia. Massive financial commitments make backing down economically catastrophic for Russia given the scale of resources already expended on military operations. The government abandoned its self-imposed spending limits and now dedicates nearly all oil revenue to sustaining military objectives rather than building long-term economic reserves. Defense spending increased by over 70% between 2022 and 2024, representing approximately 6% of gross domestic product. These expenditures cover direct military costs, payments to military families, veteran benefits, and industrial subsidies required to sustain wartime production levels. The economic distortions created by wartime spending generate artificial growth in defense-related industries, while most civilian sectors stagnate or decline. Investment patterns shifted dramatically toward military production facilities, weapons manufacturing, and supporting infrastructure that served no peacetime economic function. Companies throughout Russia retooled their operations to produce military equipment, ammunition, and supplies needed for sustained combat operations. Reversing these investments would require massive economic restructuring that could trigger widespread unemployment and business failures across regions dependent on defense spending. War crimes investigations create personal legal jeopardy for Russian leadership that makes retreat extremely dangerous for individual survival. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Putin and other high-ranking officials based on evidence of systematic attacks against civilian targets and forced deportation of Ukrainian children. These investigations continue expanding as investigators document additional evidence of deliberate targeting of hospitals, schools, and residential areas throughout occupied territories. The legal exposure means that Putin and his associates face potential prosecution if they lose power or if Russia experiences regime change. The personal legal risks extend beyond international courts to potential domestic prosecutions if Putin's government collapses. Russian opposition figures and civil society organizations have documented evidence of corruption, human rights violations, and abuse of power that could form the basis for criminal charges under a different government. International sanctions have frozen billions in assets belonging to Putin's associates, creating powerful incentives to continue fighting until those sanctions are lifted. Russian military and intelligence agencies gained unprecedented power and influence through the conflict, creating institutional momentum that favors continued fighting over negotiated settlement. The Federal Security Service expanded its authority over civilian institutions, including media, education, and business operations deemed relevant to national security. Military leadership received expanded budgets, personnel, and political influence that elevated their status within the Russian power structure. Defense contractors and military-industrial companies now employ millions of Russians and generate substantial profits that create powerful lobbying interests favoring continued military spending. State propaganda created public expectations that make compromise politically suicidal by presenting maximalist war aims as non-negotiable national requirements. Russian media consistently describes the conflict's objectives as liberating all Ukrainian territory from Western control and establishing a neutral Ukrainian government that acknowledges Russian security interests. These objectives were presented as minimum acceptable outcomes rather than ambitious goals, creating public expectations that anything less represents defeat and humiliation.